The pilot checked his oxygen mask and pushed the throttle forward. Below him, the clouds broke open like a curtain being pulled aside, and there it was, a formation of American bombers, slow and vulnerable, threading their way through a steel-gray German sky. B-17s, dozens of them, each one packed with 10 men and thousands of pounds of bombs meant for German soil. The Focke-Wulf 190 pilot had done this before. He knew exactly how this worked. The bombers had no real protection this deep into Germany. Their fighter escorts always turned back early. They had to. They simply didn't have the fuel to go the distance. He radioed his wingman, calm, confident. This was going to be easy. He had no idea that today was different. He had no idea that something new was waiting in those clouds. Something heavy, something loud, something that the men back at the Luftwaffe airfields had been calling fat, ugly, slow, a milk jug with wings, a flying bathtub. They had laughed about it at dinner, mocked the drawings in intelligence reports, passed around photographs and shaken their heads. They would not be laughing much longer. The date was the autumn of 1943. The skies over occupied Europe had become the most dangerous place on Earth. Every day, American bomber crews climbed into their planes, knowing the odds were stacked against them. The Luftwaffe was disciplined, aggressive, and deeply experienced. German pilots had been fighting since Spain, since Poland, since the Battle of Britain. They had refined their tactics to a razor's edge. And the numbers told the story. In the summer and early fall of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces was losing bombers at a rate that threatened to break the entire strategic bombing campaign. The mission planners called it acceptable losses. The crews called it something else. On some raids, 1 in 4 planes didn't come home. The men who survived one tour watched their friends die. The men who volunteered for a second tour were considered either heroes or madmen, sometimes both. The problem was simple and brutal. The escorts ran out of fuel. American fighters, the P-38 Lightnings and the early P-51 Mustangs, could not carry enough fuel to follow the bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany and then fight their way back out. So they flew with the bombers to a certain point, wagged their wings in a silent goodbye, and turned for home. And the moment those fighters turned back, the Luftwaffe came alive. German controllers tracked every movement. They had radar, they had radio networks, they had experienced wing commanders who had been doing this for years. The moment the American escorts turned back, the order went out, and German fighters rose from airfields across France, Belgium, and Germany to intercept the now naked bombers. It was a slaughter, methodical, relentless. The crews of the 8th Air Force knew what awaited them beyond escort range. They called it the Dark Zone, not on any official map, just in the minds of every man who had flown there and lived. They knew that once the friendly fighters turned away, they were on their own. They had their own guns, they had formation discipline, but they also knew that wasn't enough. Not against the Focke-Wulf 190, not against the Messerschmitt 109. So when the word started spreading through the bases in England about a new fighter, a fighter that could actually go the distance, the reaction was complicated. On one hand, hope. On the other hand, disbelief. Because the aircraft they were being shown was not what anyone expected. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was, by almost every measure, absurd. It weighed more than 7 tons fully loaded. 7 tons! Most fighter aircraft of the era weighed half that. Some weighed less. The P-47 was so large that pilots joked you didn't climb into it, you strapped it on. The engine alone, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial, was 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows and produced over 2,000 horsepower. The sound it made at full throttle was not so much a roar as a physical event. You felt it in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The cockpit sat so high off the ground that crew chiefs needed a ladder just to help pilots in and out. The landing gear was so wide and so heavy that the plane looked almost comical sitting on the tarmac. British pilots, when they first saw it, reportedly stared in silence for a long moment before one of them said, quietly, "What in God's name is that?" The German intelligence assessment was more blunt. Reports filtering back from the first encounters described the P-47 as slow to climb, heavy on the controls at low altitude, and generally inferior to the Focke-Wulf 190 in a turning fight. At low and medium altitudes, the assessment was largely correct. The German 190 could outturn it, outclimb it, and outmaneuver it in the kind of close, swirling dogfights that German pilots preferred. So the Luftwaffe was not impressed, and they let their pilots know it. Briefings at German airfields described the P-47 as a threat manageable with standard tactics. Bring it down to low altitude, force it into a turning fight, bleed its energy, kill it. The men flying P-47s in the early days knew they were being underestimated. Some of them found that frustrating. A few found it useful, because the men who understood what the Thunderbolt actually was, not what it looked like, not what it weighed, but what it could do under the right conditions, those men were beginning to figure something out. The Thunderbolt was not a dancer. It was a hammer. At high altitude, everything changed. Above 15,000 feet, the big double Wasp came into its own. The supercharger spun up, and the Thunderbolt transformed. Where a German 190 began to struggle at altitude, gasping for thinner air, the P-47 accelerated. Its top speed above 30,000 feet was over 430 miles per hour. Few aircraft in the world in 1943 could match that. And then there was the dive. German pilots learned about this the hard way. In a dive, the P-47 was virtually unstoppable. That massive weight, that enormous airframe, all 7 tons of American manufacturing muscle, built up speed in a dive like a cannonball dropped from a cathedral. German pilots who thought they had scored hits and could break away found that the P-47 followed them down, gaining ground with every second, its speed climbing past anything the more elegant German fighters could safely reach. Some German pilots pulled out of dives and looked behind them, expecting open sky. Instead, they found a Thunderbolt filling their mirror.
But speed and altitude were only part of the story. The real story was what happened when a P-47 pilot pressed the trigger. 8 Browning M2 machine guns. Say that again? 8. Each one a .50 caliber weapon capable of firing 750 to 850 rounds per minute. The guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side, and when a P-47 pilot fired all 8 at once, the combined rate of fire approached 6,000 rounds per minute. The muzzle velocity was over 2,800 feet per second. The bullets were over half an inch in diameter. They were designed not just to puncture aircraft skin, but to shred engines, snap control surfaces, ignite fuel tanks, and kill. One burst, a single coordinated squeeze of the trigger lasting just 2 seconds, that delivered roughly 200 rounds toward a target. No fighter pilot in 1943 flying for any nation wanted to be in front of a P-47 when its pilot opened fire. German aircraft, even the well-constructed Focke-Wulf 190, were not built to absorb that kind of punishment. A 2-second burst from a P-47's guns could tear an engine apart, could blow a wing root open, could turn a cockpit into something that no one walked away from. The P-47 pilots themselves sometimes described the experience of firing all 8 guns as feeling the entire airplane slow down from the recoil. The flash from the gun ports lit up the leading edges of the wings. The noise was different from anything else in the air. Early German pilots who survived encounters with the P-47's guns came back to their airfields changed men.
Their descriptions of the firepower were vivid. Some used words that did not appear in official combat reports. The casual dismissal of the Thunderbolt at German pilot briefings began to develop a quiet asterisk. The guns were no joke. But the full impact of the P-47 was not just about what it could do in combat. It was about what it changed strategically. The decision that transformed the P-47 from a capable but limited fighter into a war-changing weapon came from a combination of tactical innovation and a simple piece of equipment that had, embarrassingly, been overlooked. Drop tanks. External fuel tanks that could be carried under the wings and belly of the fighter, used up and then jettisoned before combat. The concept was not new, the engineering was not complicated, but the adoption had been slow, hampered by bureaucratic inertia, supply chain delays, and a persistent belief in some quarters that fighters should not be used as bomber escorts at all, that they should be free to seek and destroy enemy aircraft on their own terms. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, and ultimately General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, swept that thinking aside. Doolittle's order was direct. Fighters were to go with the bombers, all the way in, all the way out. If the Luftwaffe wouldn't come to the fighters would go to the Luftwaffe, over their own airfields if necessary. With drop tanks, a P-47 could now escort bombers much deeper into Germany, and with Doolittle's new aggressive posture, P-47 pilots were no longer just bodyguards, they were hunters. The change in Luftwaffe morale over the following months was documented in German records captured after the war. There was confusion at first, then frustration, then something that the Germans, a people not given to admitting such things easily, recorded in their own words as anxiety. The escort fighters were everywhere now. They were staying longer. They were attacking, not just defending. And those massive, ugly, ridiculous American fighters with their 8 guns were proving incredibly difficult to bring down. The P-47's durability had become legendary among American crews and feared among German ones. The airframe was designed to take punishment. The radial engine, with its air-cooled cylinders arranged in a circle, had a critical survival advantage over liquid-cooled engines. A liquid-cooled engine, like those in the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt 109, could be knocked out of action by a single bullet through the cooling system. One line punctured, and the engine overheated and seized within minutes. The P-47's radial engine had no such vulnerability. Pilots flew home with entire cylinders blown off the engine, with oil streaming back across the fuselage, with chunks of the cowling missing. Stories circulated of P-47s taking 20mm cannon shells in the engine and still making it back across the channel, of pilots landing with their aircraft riddled with holes that should have been fatal. The mechanics who worked on these planes developed a dark kind of pride. They called it fixing the impossible. German pilots noticed. Shooting down a P-47 required commitment. It required multiple hits in critical places. The usual German tactic of firing a quick burst and breaking away produced a damaged Thunderbolt, not a destroyed one. And a damaged but flying P-47 was still armed with 8 50-caliber guns. Several German pilots learned this distinction too late. By the spring of 1944, the P-47 was operating in a role that no one had fully anticipated when the aircraft was designed: ground attack. With bombs and rockets added to its already fearsome armament, the Thunderbolt became a terror to German ground forces. Anything that moved on a road in France was potential prey for a P-47. German supply convoys, armored columns, rail lines, fuel depots, bridges, marshalling yards. The Thunderbolt flew low and fast and hit hard, and its ability to absorb ground fire and keep flying made it extraordinarily effective in this role. German soldiers, troops who had marched across Europe behind the Luftwaffe's air cover, who had watched Stuka dive bombers clear the way ahead of them, who had grown up in a military culture that venerated air power, were now experiencing what it felt like to be on the wrong end of it. The sound of a Thunderbolt's engine at low altitude, that distinctive deep rolling thunder of the Double Wasp at full power, became something German soldiers associated with casualties. They developed their own name for it, a nickname born not from admiration, but from fear. The men of the Wehrmacht called it Jabo, short for Jagbomber, fighter bomber. They did not say it lightly. By the time the Normandy invasion came in June of 1944, the P-47 had become one of the most important tactical weapons in the Allied arsenal. On D-Day itself, Thunderbolts flew continuous patrols over the beaches, hunting anything German that tried to move toward the coast. The German 7th Army, attempting to rush reinforcements to the landing zones, found every road a gauntlet. Every daylight movement was a risk. The Thunderbolts were always somewhere overhead, and the men on the ground never knew when one would roll in from the sun. The campaign in France that followed was shaped in no small part by this reality. German armored divisions that should have been able to move at night and rest by day found that the operational window was shrinking. American air power, P-47s at its edge, was pressing them around the clock.
The famous breakout at St. Lo in late July 1944, Operation Cobra, was preceded by a carpet-bombing assault of legendary scale. And as German units tried to reorganize and counterattack, the P-47s were there. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 became one of the most catastrophic defeats in German military history, a near encirclement of an entire German army group. And the roads leading into and out of that pocket became what Allied pilots called the killing ground. The scenes that aerial observers described were beyond anything most of the pilots had trained to imagine. Column after column of German vehicles, horses, artillery, staff cars, and infantry, all jammed together on the roads trying to escape, and wave after wave of Allied aircraft, P-47s prominent among them, coming down to strike. When it was over, the roads were impassable under the wreckage. German panzer units that had rolled into France in June as feared veteran formations emerged from August as shattered remnants. Commanders who had started the Normandy campaign with hundreds of tanks counted their survivors in dozens. The Luftwaffe, which had promised to defend the Wehrmacht from the air, was a shadow of what it had been. Its best pilots were dead or so outnumbered that their bravery made no difference. The P-47 alone did not win the war in France. That would be a simple story, and war is never simple. The Sherman tank crews, the infantry in the hedgerows, the logisticians driving trucks over roads that barely existed, all of them were part of it. But the Thunderbolt was present at every critical moment, escorting bombers into Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to bleed itself white trying to stop the raids, hunting supply lines that kept German armor moving, standing between bombers and the fighters trying to kill them. The pilots who flew the P-47 were mostly young. Many of them were barely 20 years old. They had grown up in the Depression, gone to school in towns where a new car was an event, joined the military after Pearl Harbor, and within 2 years found themselves alone at 30,000 feet over Germany, deciding in split seconds whether to turn or dive, whether to pursue or brake, whether they would be alive in 10 minutes. They had been handed a machine that the enemy laughed at. They turned it into something that changed the course of the war. The numbers, in the end, are stark. The P-47 flew over 546,000 combat sorties during the war. It destroyed nearly 12,000 enemy aircraft. It dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. It lost 3,499 of its own to enemy action. Those losses were not small. Each one was a man who did not come home. Each one was a family that received a telegram and tried to understand.
But the ratio of damage dealt to damage received was extraordinary, and the impact on the Luftwaffe went beyond the numbers. It was psychological. The constant pressure, the inability to protect their own ground forces, the growing realization that American industrial production could replace every P-47 lost faster than Germany could replace the pilots killed in air combat. All of it wore at German morale in ways that no single battle could measure. A Luftwaffe fighter ace, one of the top-scoring German pilots to survive the war, was interviewed by American officers in 1945. He was asked what had changed the air war. When had Germany lost control of the sky? He thought for a moment. Then he said it was when the American fighters started coming all the way in, when the escorts didn't turn back anymore, when we knew that even over our own fields we were not safe. He did not mention the P-47 by name. He didn't have to, because anyone who had flown in those skies knew exactly what he was talking about. There is a temptation looking back at machines like the Thunderbolt to see only the engineering, the horsepower numbers, the gun specifications, the range data. But behind every technical specification is a decision someone made, a designer who believed in an idea when no one else did, a commander who chose to trust a new aircraft over a proven one, a young pilot who climbed into a cockpit that the enemy thought was a joke and flew it into the most defended airspace in history. The P-47 was ugly, it was heavy, it was loud, and the men who flew it carried something the numbers never fully captured. They carried the weight of knowing what was at stake, that the bombers behind them, slow and straight and full of their friends, would survive or die based on what they did in the next few minutes, that the ground troops below them, the men in the mud fighting for every hedgerow, needed them to be there, that a war that had started with the world burning could only end one way if enough Americans were willing to climb into enough aircraft and go back out day after day into skies where everything was trying to kill them. They were willing. The Germans had laughed at the airplane. They had not considered the men inside it. Perhaps that is the question worth sitting with, not just about this war or this aircraft or this moment in history, but about what happens when people in power underestimate something, when they look at something unfamiliar and see weakness instead of taking the time to understand what they are actually facing. The Focke-Wulf pilots who went up to intercept those early Thunderbolts had been told what to expect. They had been handed someone else's assessment and trusted it. The P-47 pilots had been handed an aircraft everyone doubted and chose to understand it. In the end, that difference may have mattered as much as the guns. What do you think made the P-47 truly dangerous? The machine itself or the men who refused to give up on it?